out of Africa. We all know the story. Humanity begins in East Africa, then wave after wave of human species escapes into Eurasia. Every graphic points in one direction. Every animation shows humans migrating out of Africa. Every ancient skull outside Africa becomes little more than a temporary side branch destined to vanish. Yet something strange happens when the actual fossil pattern, the genetic structure, and the newest ancestry models are placed together on the same table. The arrows begin turning around. The center of gravity shifts northward. And suddenly, East Africa stops looking like the engine of human evolution and starts looking like the final receiving zone of lineages that formed elsewhere. That reversal sits at the center of one of the most unsettling implications hidden inside the David Reich ancestry model shown in these diagrams. The public heard endless claims about a triumphant African expansion shaping Eurasia, but the structure of the model itself points towards an entirely different picture. Eurasia becomes the long-term source of the most important branching events, while deep Africa becomes isolated, ancient, and genetically separated for immense stretches of time. The image of a vibrant African center constantly producing new human forms begins collapsing into something far stranger. East Africa starts looking less like the birthplace of innovation and more like a distant cul-de-sac, occupied by an archaic branch cut off from the northern evolutionary theatre for over 1 million years. The implications become enormous once the timeline is followed carefully from the beginning. Around 1.5 million years ago, the model splits into 2 major branches. One branch leads toward what is labelled African Archaic, often associated with African ergaster populations deep within the continent. The other branch leads toward Eurasian Archaic populations spread across the Near East and Greater Eurasia. This first split matters because it completely changes the emotional framing of human evolution. The standard dogma conditions people to imagine Africa as the central trunk and Eurasia as scattered offshoots. Yet here, the Eurasian side becomes the lineage that continues generating almost every important later branch connected to modern humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and the Sema populations. Meanwhile, the African branch appears astonishingly isolated, not isolated for a few thousand years, not isolated during a brief climate event, isolated for roughly 1.5 million years according to the deep structure of the model. That means the African Archaic branch becomes something closer to a surviving southern relic population, while the northern populations continue diversifying, mixing, experimenting with technology, and splitting into multiple advanced lineages across Eurasia and the Near East. This creates an immediate contradiction with the emotional mythology surrounding East Africa. If the African branch sat isolated for immense spans of time while the critical branching structure unfolded to the north, then East Africa stops functioning as the primary engine of human transformation. Instead, the Near East and Greater Eurasian corridor become the dynamic interaction zone where the decisive evolutionary events occur. That single reversal changes everything about how the human story feels. The next major turning point arrives around 750,000 years ago. This is where the Eurasian Archaic branch itself divides again. One branch heads toward the Denisovan and Heidelberg lineage, associated with populations such as those connected to Sema de los Huesos. The other branch leads toward what Reich labels the modern lineage. That phrase alone carries explosive implications because the model places the ancestry leading toward Homo sapiens inside a Eurasian context long before the appearance of recognizable modern humans in Africa. This means the ancestry leading towards modern humans did not suddenly erupt from East Africa in isolation. Instead, it already existed as a differentiated branch within a broader Eurasian Archaic framework hundreds of thousands of years earlier. The Near East begins looking less like a temporary migration corridor and more like the actual evolutionary furnace where the ancestral structure leading toward later humanity was forged. And this is exactly where the fossil record begins behaving in a deeply uncomfortable manner for the standard dogma. The Near East contains repeated signs of advanced behavioral and technological continuity stretching backward through immense spans of time. Levallois technology appears across this northern interaction sphere with extraordinary sophistication. Blade traditions emerge early. transitional forms appear repeatedly. Human groups carrying mixtures of archaic and modern anatomy move through the Levant long before the famous late African expansion story pushed into textbooks.
So the idea I'm interested in is the possibility that there is a population here that invents the Middle Stone Age, the Middle Paleolithic, sometimes called Levallois technology, and that people from this population expand into Europe, and they mix with the local archaic humans who are there. And that is what this 5% interbreeding event is. It happens 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. And it produces a group that, as it expands across this landscape in Europe, mostly picks up the local DNA and becomes mostly archaic genetically, but retains its modern human culture, the way of making stone tools and some of its traditions. So you ask, where are these people living? Who knows, right? Like, in this scenario, the 80% is coming from the Caucasus or Northeast Africa, where this Middle Stone Age formed. It's from this population that forms the Middle Stone Age.
The standard dogma attempts to force all of this into a framework where every northern appearance represents little more than failed migrations from Africa. Yet the Reich structure reverses the direction of influence. The Near East lineage becomes older, more central, and more connected to the ancestry leading toward modern humans themselves. Then another critical branching event appears around 550,000 years ago. This is the split involving the Cima lineage. Cima de los Huesos in Spain becomes enormously important because these individuals already display unmistakable Neanderthal affinities extraordinarily early. Massive faces, heavy brow structure, and genetic connections all point toward a lineage deeply rooted in Western Eurasia. Yet according to the model, this Cima lineage branches from the broader Denisovan-Heidelberg structure after the original modern lineage had already separated. That means the European Neanderthal world and the ancestry leading toward Homo sapiens were sister branches inside a much older Eurasian system. They were not independent inventions arising separately on different continents. They were intertwined descendants of northern populations already structured long before the appearance of classic modern humans. This is where the story becomes even more revealing. Around 350,000 years ago, the so-called Levallois lineage emerges as one of the decisive populations in the entire model. And according to Reich, this lineage was associated with the Near East rather than deep sub-Saharan Africa. That detail destroys the emotional foundation of the simplistic out-of-Africa story because the Levallois lineage becomes the actual ancestral stream leading toward both Homo sapiens and portions of Neanderthal ancestry. The Levallois lineage matters because Levallois technology represents something radically different from earlier stone traditions. It demands planning depth, geometric thinking, and complex reduction strategies. This was not random rock smashing. These populations carried advanced cognitive organization, long-range movement patterns, and highly adaptable survival systems across interconnected territories, stretching through the Near East and adjacent regions. And once again, the geographic center sits north of East Africa. The standard narrative trained people to think of technological complexity radiating outward from Africa into primitive Eurasian landscapes. Yet the structure of this model suggests the opposite direction entirely. The Levallois lineage emerges inside the Near Eastern interaction zone, then later contributes ancestry both into Europe and into Africa itself. Around 250,000 years ago, another major event unfolds. One branch of the Levallois lineage moves into Europe and interbreeds heavily with the Cima-derived populations. This produces the classic Neanderthal lineage. According to the model, Neanderthals were not pure descendants of some isolated European species. They were formed through mixture between the incoming Levallois-related lineage and the older Cima branch already present in Europe. That mixture explains why Neanderthals display both highly derived features and surprisingly modern characteristics at the same time. At nearly the same moment, another branch of the Levallois lineage pushes southward into Africa and mixes with the deeply isolated African archaic population. This event becomes one of the most important turning points in the entire human story because it effectively creates the ancestry associated with Homo sapiens. And suddenly Jebel Irhoud in Morocco starts making far more sense. Jebel Irhoud always sat awkwardly inside the East African-centered mythology. The faces appear surprisingly modern, while the brain cases retain archaic structure. The geography also causes discomfort, because Morocco sits thousands of miles from the famous East African cradle narrative. Yet, within the Reich-style framework, the picture becomes much clearer. Jebel Irhoud looks exactly like what would emerge from admixture between an incoming northern Levallois lineage and an older African archaic population. The anatomy itself almost tells the story directly. The faces look advanced. The technological behavior looks advanced, yet traces of archaic structure linger in the skull form. Instead of representing the first isolated appearance of modern humans deep in Africa, Irhoud begins looking like the product of northern ancestry entering Africa and mixing with ancient local populations. That completely flips the emotional map upside down. Africa stops appearing as the uncontested source of humanity, and instead becomes one of several major interaction zones, receiving ancestry streams from a broader Afro-Eurasian system centered heavily around the Near East. This also explains why so many early African fossils appear strangely mosaic. Some display modern faces with archaic skull shapes. Others carry advanced behavior alongside deeply ancient anatomy. The standard narrative attempted to force these contradictions into a neat, linear progression entirely inside Africa. Yet the Reich structure explains the mosaic naturally through repeated mixture between isolated African populations and incoming northern lineages. And this is precisely why the out-of-Africa diagrams feel increasingly artificial. Those diagrams were built emotionally first and scientifically second. They were constructed to reinforce a moralized geographic story, where every major innovation begins in East Africa before radiating outward. Yet, the actual branching structure of these ancestry models reveals something far messier and far more interconnected. The Near East becomes the great hinge point of human evolution. It sits between Africa, Europe, and Asia. It functions as the crossroads where populations repeatedly meet, separate, and merge again. Levallois systems flourish there. Archaic populations overlap there. Denisovan related ancestry branches from there. Neanderthal ancestry forms through interaction linked to populations moving out from there. And the ancestry leading toward Homo sapiens itself appears connected to northern lineages, feeding back into Africa rather than simply exploding outward from it. This also explains why the archaeological continuity across the Near East becomes so difficult to dismiss. Similar technological systems appear repeatedly across enormous spans of time. Transitional anatomy appears again and again. Human groups carrying mixed features occupy the region continuously. The area behaves less like a migration highway and more like a stable evolutionary core. The emotional resistance to this idea comes from more than science. People were conditioned from childhood to imagine Africa as a sacred origin point where every important step in humanity occurred first. Museums, schoolbooks, magazines, television specials, and simplified evolutionary charts reinforced that image constantly. Yet the fossil pattern itself never fit comfortably inside such a clean story. Important fossils kept appearing outside East Africa. Sophisticated technologies emerged far beyond the supposed core zone. Deep genetic divergences pointed toward ancient population structure extending across Eurasia. And now the ancestry models themselves increasingly expose that broader structure openly. The irony becomes almost impossible to ignore. The very models intended to refine the out-of-Africa framework now expose how dependent humanity was on northern interaction zones outside sub-Saharan Africa. Once the timelines are followed carefully, the Near East begins looking like the true engine room, where lineages split, merged, evolved technologically, and generated the ancestry streams later carried both into Europe and into Africa. Even the terminology starts feeling misleading. People hear the phrase modern human ancestry and automatically picture East Africa. Yet within this framework, the ancestry leading toward Homo sapiens existed inside a northern Eurasian structure long before recognizable sapiens anatomy emerged in Africa. The biological ingredients were already there. Africa became the place where one branch mixed with deeply isolated archaic populations and eventually crystallized into the forms later recognized as Homo sapiens. That is not the same story at all. And the deeper one looks, the stranger the map becomes. Europe preserves the Sima lineage. Siberia preserves Denisovan ancestry. The Near East preserves Levallois continuity. Morocco preserves the earliest recognizable sapiens-like faces. Yet East Africa increasingly looks like the geographic endpoint where incoming northern ancestry encountered ancient isolated populations rather than the uncontested birthplace of everything human. Even the emotional language surrounding human evolution starts unraveling under this model. Terms like cradle and birthplace suddenly sound simplistic. Human evolution stops looking like a single tree rooted in one sacred location and starts looking more like a sprawling network stretched across interconnected territories from Western Eurasia into Africa. Populations split apart, drifted genetically, mixed again, carried technologies across enormous distances, and repeatedly reshaped one another through contact. The linear story collapses because reality was never linear. And perhaps that explains why certain fossils always generated such tension. Jebel Irhoud never fit cleanly. Cima de los Huesos carried surprisingly ancient Neanderthal signals. Levantine populations repeatedly appeared too advanced, too early. Denisovan ancestry kept revealing deeper complexity than expected. The fossil pattern itself kept resisting the tidy narrative imposed upon it. Something did not quite fit. Now the ancestry structure reveals why. The model points toward a northern evolutionary theatre centered heavily around the Near East, where the major ancestral branches leading toward modern humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans were already differentiating hundreds of thousands of years before the famous late African expansion story. Africa remained critically important, but not in the simplistic manner people were taught. Instead, Africa became one side of a much larger interconnected system shaped by incoming ancestry, archaic survival, and repeated mixture. And once that realization settles in, the entire emotional geography of human evolution changes forever. East Africa no longer stands alone at the center of the story. The Near East rises from the background and becomes the great forgotten engine of human transformation, the place where lineages converged and separated again, where Levallois intelligence flourished, where the ancestry leading toward Homo sapiens already existed deep in prehistory, and where the branches leading toward Neanderthals and Denisovans diverged long before modern humans carried their final recognizable form into the fossil record. The arrows pointing outward from Africa suddenly look incomplete. Some of the most important arrows pointed back in. Humans were not bottled up in East Africa for 2 million years, slowly evolving like cartoon characters, waiting for a magical moment when they were finally emancipated. Thank you for watching. If this story changed the way you picture human origins, then you are beginning to see how fragile the maps truly were. Beneath the confident museum charts and simplified migration arrows sits a far more tangled human past filled with mixture, forgotten populations, and ancient northern lineages that refuse to stay hidden. And somewhere inside that tangled past, between the Levallois makers of the Near East, the isolated archaic groups of Africa, the Sima people of ancient Europe, and the vanished Denisovan branches of Eurasia, the real human story still waits to be fully uncovered.